A quiet morning. It was still early in the day, and the world had not yet fully awakened. The first light of dawn slowly crept over the sleepy horizon, casting long shadows over the small, unassuming town. Marcus Aldridge, a man of extraordinary wealth and influence, had long learned to appreciate these quiet moments, moments untouched by the frenzy of business meetings, the weight of corporate decisions, or the constant pressure of public scrutiny. For once, he could be just a man, no title, no expectations, no watchful eyes upon him. Marcus sat behind the wheel of his sleek black car, staring out the window as he navigated the winding road. His thoughts, as usual, drifted to memories of a simpler time, his college days, when life had been filled with uncertainty and possibility. Back then, he had been a hungry student, dreaming big but living small, fighting for every opportunity that came his way. Those memories still felt fresh to him, and they always tugged at his heart when he was alone. The familiar, weathered sign of the roadside diner loomed ahead as he approached the corner. It was the same diner he'd come to every morning for over 30 years. It wasn't much to look at, a small, rectangular building with peeling paint and mismatched windows, tucked away on a forgotten stretch of highway. But it was a place that felt like home, offering comfort and a sense of peace that no mansion or luxury hotel ever could. As Marcus parked his car and stepped out, the cool morning air greeted him. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp scent of the outdoors wash over him. There was something about the simplicity of the town that made him feel grounded, despite the whirlwind of wealth and power that surrounded him every day. In this small diner, he was just another regular, and that was the way he liked it. His bodyguard, Raymond, who was a few steps behind him, kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings. Marcus didn't mind. Raymond was a professional, always alert, always ready to protect. But Marcus didn't feel the same sense of danger here as he did in the cities or at high-profile events. There was no need for that constant wariness. This was a place where people knew him, where people respected him, and where he had never felt threatened. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was calm and welcoming. The clink of coffee cups, the low hum of conversations, and the sizzle of bacon on the griddle created a familiar rhythm that wrapped around Marcus like a blanket. The staff greeted him with smiles and nods, their faces lined with years of hard work. It was clear they knew who he was, but they didn't treat him any differently than they treated anyone else. To them, he wasn't a billionaire, he was just Marcus, the man who had frequented their diner for decades. Carol, the waitress who had served him since his college days, approached him with a warm smile. Her face was round and kind, and her hair was streaked with silver, but her energy had never waned. "The usual, Marcus?" she asked, her voice light and familiar. He smiled back, settling into the same worn booth by the window where he had sat countless times. "Yes, Carol." "Thank you," he replied, leaning back as he glanced out at the rising sun. Carol nodded and disappeared behind the counter to place his order. As Marcus settled into his seat, his eyes wandered over the diner's interior, vintage photos on the walls, a jukebox in the corner, and the same familiar faces of the regulars who had come and gone over the years. He could almost feel the years slip away as he reminisced about the past, about the days when he was a young man with big dreams and even bigger struggles. He had been just like the others who came here, hungry for opportunity, for a chance to build something for himself. The diner, with its humble charm, had seen him through it all. He'd come here in his college days, hungry both for knowledge and for a sense of belonging. Back then, he'd been a small-town kid with little more than his ambition and a dream of success. No one could have predicted that this small, simple diner would become such an integral part of his story. Raymond stood outside, ever watchful, scanning the surrounding streets with a practiced eye. Marcus was always aware of his presence, even if he didn't always acknowledge it. The bodyguard was a part of his world now, but there was something about the diner that made him feel like he could step outside of that world, even for just a moment. His attention shifted to the chatter in the diner. The regulars were gossiping about local news, nothing important, just the typical small-town conversations about family matters, work, and the latest weather forecasts. But as Marcus sipped his coffee and stared out the window, he couldn't help but notice a strange shift in the air. There was a low, almost unnoticeable tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't coming from the people in the diner, but from the world outside. Before he could dwell on it further, the bell above the door rang. Marcus turned to see a small figure darting through the doorway, a boy no older than 12. He was out of breath, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and urgency. It wasn't unusual for children to come and go in the area, many ran errands or played nearby. But this child, with his ragged clothes and anxious expression, seemed different. The boy spotted Marcus immediately. His eyes locked onto him, and without a second thought, he bolted toward the table. He was running clumsily, his sneakers barely staying on his feet, but the urgency in his movement was unmistakable. Marcus, always calm and composed, didn't react immediately. Instead, he merely raised an eyebrow and waited. Raymond, ever watchful, moved toward the boy, but Marcus stopped him with a single, steadying gesture. "It's fine, Raymond," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make the bodyguard hesitate. Raymond looked at him, uncertain but trusting his judgment. He stepped back, though his eyes remained on the boy. The kid reached the table, panting heavily. His face was sweaty, his small hands clutching the edges of his shirt as if for support. Marcus noticed the boy's scuffed shoes, the dirt on his clothes, and the weariness in his eyes. This wasn't just any child, it was Ryan, the local shoe shiner. Marcus had seen him many times over the years, polishing shoes with a skill that was rare for someone so young. Ryan had always been polite, offering a smile even when his work was difficult. He had come from nothing but seemed to carry himself with a quiet dignity. But now, his eyes were filled with something else, fear. Ryan took a deep breath and looked up at Marcus, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Sir, don't eat here. The food isn't safe." Marcus blinked, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't uncommon for people to give warnings, but there was something about the boy's tone that made him pause. It wasn't the usual kind of harmless advice or a joke, it was something far more serious. Something he couldn't ignore. Before Marcus could reply, Ryan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, though the tension in his expression was anything but subtle. "I overheard some men," he said, eyes darting nervously around the diner. "They were talking. They said they were going to poison a billionaire here. I heard them clearly." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Poison? A plot against him? It sounded absurd, but the look in Ryan's eyes told him this was no idle fantasy. The kid had nothing to gain from lying. Raymond took a step forward, his protective instincts kicking in, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. He wanted to hear more. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said your name, sir. I swear it's you they meant." The kid's warning. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest as he watched Marcus carefully. The weight of what he had just said hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. He was just a boy, only 12, yet here he was, standing before one of the wealthiest men in the world, delivering a message that seemed too impossible to believe. The nervous sweat on Ryan's forehead only worsened as he awaited Marcus's response. For a moment, there was silence. The quiet hum of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Marcus Aldridge, the billionaire who could buy anything, who had everything he could ever want, looked at Ryan with a calmness that only added to the tension. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he was truly considering what the boy had said. Ryan couldn't help but shift his weight nervously from foot to foot. He knew he had to get this right. He had to convince Marcus that this wasn't some misguided prank or a moment of childhood imagination. He couldn't afford to be wrong. The lives of more than just one person might be on the line. I swear, Ryan continued, his voice now shaky, I heard them. There were two men, talking like they knew exactly what they were going to do. They laughed about it, too, like it was some kind of joke. They said they'd been planning it for weeks. His eyes locked onto Marcus's, pleading for him to understand. They said they would poison the food in this diner, and you'd be the one who would eat it. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply sat there, studying Ryan's face, trying to gauge the truth in the boy's words. The longer he remained silent, the more Ryan's anxiety grew. The seconds felt like hours, his mind racing as he considered what he had overheard. What if it was true? What if Marcus, the man who had always treated him kindly, was in danger because of something he had no control over? Look, kid, Marcus said, breaking the silence at last. His voice was steady, reassuring, but it carried an undertone of concern that Ryan could not ignore. I appreciate the warning. I really do. But people talk. I've been coming here for years, and nothing's ever happened. It's just talk, Ryan. People get paranoid sometimes. They make up stories. Ryan shook his head furiously. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to find the words that would make Marcus believe him. But they were serious, sir. One of them said you'd be the perfect target. A billionaire. They thought they could get away with it here because no one would expect it. No one would notice. I've never seen them before, but they knew who you were. I heard them say your name. Ryan's voice cracked, his eyes wide and filled with desperation. Please, you have to believe me. Marcus studied Ryan for a long while, taking in his words. He could sense the sincerity in the boy's voice, could see the fear written across his face. This wasn't just some wild tale, Ryan was clearly shaken. But Marcus was not easily rattled. His entire life had been filled with moments when people tried to manipulate him, trick him, or take advantage of his wealth. He had been in the business world long enough to know how to spot a lie. And yet, this felt different. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the worn wooden table. It was his way of thinking, of considering all the possibilities before making a decision. He had always been one to rely on logic, to trust in reason. But this was something he hadn't prepared for. Someone was out to get him, and they'd chosen the most unexpected of places, his favorite diner, the one place where he had felt truly safe. As he thought, he couldn't help but remember how many times he had walked through those doors without a second thought. How many times had he sat at this table, absorbed in his own thoughts, unaware that someone might have been watching him? How many times had he eaten without hesitation, trusting the food in front of him, never once suspecting that something as simple as a meal could threaten his life? Ryan's words echoed in his mind. They said your name. They knew exactly who you were. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt. Could it be possible? Could someone actually want him dead? You've been good to me, sir, Ryan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper now. I don't want anything bad to happen to you. I just thought, you should know. I overheard them, and I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. Marcus could see the sincerity in Ryan's eyes. The boy wasn't just seeking attention. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was simply doing what he thought was right, and that was something Marcus could respect. For all the wealth and power he had accumulated over the years, Marcus had never lost his sense of right and wrong. It was one of the things that had grounded him, kept him humble despite his success. But this was a different kind of test. He looked at Ryan, studying him with a mixture of appreciation and curiosity. You've done a good thing by telling me. I don't know if it's real, but I'll keep it in mind. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it now. Ryan's eyes filled with hope, but it was short-lived. The doubt in Marcus's voice hadn't gone unnoticed. The boy's shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him. He had done all he could to warn Marcus, but what if it wasn't enough? Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. He handed it to Ryan, a small token of gratitude for his bravery. "Here, kid. You've earned this," he said, pushing the bill toward him. Ryan hesitated, glancing down at the money. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. "Thank you," he muttered, though his voice was quieter now, tinged with the weight of the situation. He knew there was nothing more he could do but wait and hope that Marcus would take his warning seriously. Before Ryan could turn to leave, Marcus placed his hand on the boy's arm, a gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "Listen, I appreciate the concern, but don't go thinking you've saved me. There are always rumors, always people who want to stir things up. This may be nothing, but I'll keep my eyes open, all right?" Ryan nodded, though he wasn't sure if that reassured him. He turned to leave, casting one last glance at Marcus, who was now deep in thought, his fingers still drumming on the table. The door jingled as Ryan stepped outside, and Marcus's gaze lingered on the small figure as he disappeared into the morning light. As the door swung shut behind him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had lived his life with his guard up, but this warning felt different. The unease in his stomach was growing stronger, gnawing at him, and the rational part of his mind couldn't ignore it. The minutes passed, but the tension in the air seemed to only deepen. The coffee before him, which had once been comforting, now sat cold and untouched. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring out the window, his thoughts swirling. What if Ryan was telling the truth? The poisonous choice. Marcus sat still, almost frozen in time, as the moments stretched out in heavy silence. Ryan had left the diner, but his warning remained. The air felt thicker now, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation. Marcus could still see the boy's pleading face, the desperate sincerity in his eyes as he had spoken about overhearing the plot. He ran a hand over his face and let out a slow breath. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to let fear, however subtle, take root in his mind. After all, Marcus Aldrich was a man of logic, of reason. His success was built on calculated decisions, sharp intuition, and a razor-thin ability to see through lies and deception. And in his years of dealing with the complexities of business and the darker sides of wealth, one thing had become clear: people didn't usually target billionaires in places like this. It didn't make sense. His eyes wandered toward the door through which Ryan had exited. The diner was quiet now, save for the clatter of the kitchen staff, the low murmur of voices from the other patrons. The food was cold in front of him, untouched. But his appetite was the last thing on his mind. Something about the moment had shifted, something intangible that he couldn't quite name. He had heard the boy's words, and deep down, a small voice whispered that perhaps he couldn't afford to dismiss them so easily. Marcus sighed, shifting his gaze to the window. The morning sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the street. It was an ordinary scene, one he had witnessed hundreds of times before. But now, with Ryan's warning rattling in his head, it all seemed different. Maybe I should call security, Marcus thought, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his coffee cup. But the notion felt almost silly. Calling his security team would likely lead to nothing. They would conduct a thorough sweep, check the diner's security cameras, maybe even interrogate some of the staff. But Marcus knew that no matter how thorough they were, there was no guarantee they would uncover anything, no guarantee that they would be able to find out who these men were or what they intended. It wasn't that Marcus doubted his security team, they were the best, after all. But this situation, the one Ryan had described, didn't feel like something that could be easily resolved with a few phone calls and a handful of background checks. This was different. This was personal. This was someone, or perhaps several someones, who had planned, who had been patient enough to find an opportunity like this. Suddenly, the weight of it all hit Marcus like a cold wave. A sense of vulnerability crept up his spine, uninvited and unwelcome. He had spent so many years on top of the world, always in control, always the one calling the shots. But now it felt as though the ground was slipping from beneath him, and for the first time in a long time, he was unsure of what was coming next. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a scrape of a chair against the floor, the sound of someone approaching him. Marcus turned his head slightly to see Carol, the waitress, walking toward him with a concerned look on her face. She had noticed the shift in his demeanor, no doubt. She had served him for years and could likely read him better than anyone else in the diner. "You okay, Marcus?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a note of gentle concern. Marcus hesitated, considering how much to say. In a place like this, a small-town diner with its modest surroundings, it was difficult to keep anything under wraps. People noticed when you didn't show up for your usual morning visit, and when you did show up, they noticed if you seemed off. Carol, being sharp as ever, was no exception. "I'm fine," Marcus said after a long pause, giving her a small, reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile he reserved for situations like this, one that masked the undercurrent of doubt that had taken root inside him. But Carol didn't buy it. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced by his attempt at brushing things off. "Are you sure?" she asked, glancing at the half-eaten plate of food in front of him. "You usually clean that plate off in no time. You're not usually one to leave a meal untouched." Marcus stared at the plate for a moment, as if seeing it for the first time. The eggs, once fluffy and golden, were now limp, and the bacon had cooled into an unappealing, greasy texture. He had no appetite, and even if he did, he didn't trust the food anymore. Ryan's warning was still fresh in his mind, and no matter how much he tried to push it aside, the fear it ignited in him lingered like a heavy fog. "I'm just thinking, Carol," Marcus replied, his voice quieter now. "Just thinking about some things." Carol nodded, but her expression softened. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. You've always been kind to us here, Marcus. We don't want anything bad to happen to you." There was something genuine in her voice, a quiet kindness that made Marcus pause. She wasn't just a waitress. She was part of the fabric of this place, and in a way, she and the other regulars were a part of his life, a life that now felt suddenly more fragile than ever. Marcus watched her as she walked away, her footsteps light and sure as she returned to the kitchen. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he remained seated, his thoughts spiraling around Ryan's warning. Could it be true? Could someone actually want him dead? The possibility seemed absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a strange, terrible reality he might have to face. His mind raced with questions. Who would want to hurt him? Who would have the resources, the time, and the patience to plan such a thing? And why now? Why here, in a little diner on the outskirts of a small town where no one would ever expect anything sinister? It wasn't like Marcus hadn't made enemies over the years, every billionaire did. But even then, most of his adversaries were either too public in their disdain or too cautious to ever act on it. They played the long game, always keeping a safe distance, and they were careful not to provoke him too much. They weren't the type of people who would risk exposure for something like poisoning him in a public place. Yet, the more Marcus thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random threat. It felt personal. It felt like someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment was here. The logical part of Marcus's mind told him to dismiss it, to continue with his usual routine and let his security team handle it. They would look into it, investigate, and find out if anything had been planned. But a gnawing sense of dread was steadily building inside him. The voice that had initially told him to brush Ryan off now grew louder, warning him to be cautious, to take this threat seriously. The fact that Ryan had come to him, the fact that the boy had warned him, even at the risk of his own safety, felt significant. Marcus wasn't used to being approached like that, not by anyone, especially not someone from a background as difficult as Ryan's. The boy wasn't asking for money or attention. He wasn't looking to make a name for himself. He was simply trying to protect someone who had been kind to him, someone who had never treated him like a charity case. Marcus stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He wasn't sure what exactly he intended to do, but he knew one thing: he couldn't just sit there any longer. He had to act. His bodyguard, Raymond, was still standing watch outside, scanning the street with his sharp eyes. But Marcus knew it wasn't enough to rely solely on Raymond or his team. Something deeper, something more instinctual, told him that if he was going to survive this, if he was going to outsmart whoever was behind this plot, he would need to trust his own instincts. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus realized that his instincts were telling him to trust the kid. As he left the diner, his mind was already racing with plans. He would investigate further. He would find out who was behind this and make sure they couldn't get away with it. But in the back of his mind, there was another thought that lingered. If he was going to survive, he couldn't do it alone. The shadow of doubt. The hours that followed were a blur of unease for Marcus. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that Ryan's warning wasn't just some passing scare. As the morning slipped into afternoon, the weight of uncertainty hung heavily in the air, wrapping itself around Marcus like a thick fog. He had left the diner, his stomach unsettled, his mind spinning, but still, the thought of the poisoned food gnawed at him. It wasn't like Marcus to second-guess himself. For most of his life, he had made decisions with unwavering confidence. He built his empire on calculated risks, and his ability to read people, situations, and threats had always kept him several steps ahead of anyone who might have tried to harm him. But now, it felt as though the very rules he had lived by were being turned upside down. His usual routine no longer brought the comfort it once had. The meetings he attended, the phone calls he made, even the fine business lunches that once filled him with purpose, now seemed hollow. He couldn't shake the thought of those men Ryan had overheard. He couldn't ignore the fact that the boy had known his name, had known about him in a way that felt too personal, too precise. Marcus had returned to his private office at the towering glass building that served as his headquarters. He sat at his sleek wooden desk, the city skyline outside offering a stunning contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. His fingers drummed lightly against the surface, a rhythm he had often used to help himself think. But today, the motion felt futile. What if it's true? What if they were serious? He knew that asking himself these questions wouldn't lead to any real answers, but he couldn't stop. The mere possibility of someone targeting him, someone out there plotting against him, left him feeling exposed in a way he had never experienced. He had built his life to be impenetrable. He surrounded himself with the best security, trusted only a few select people with his most private information, and yet here he was, sitting in his office, waiting for answers that didn't seem to come. Marcus had ordered Raymond to stay in the lobby, to keep watch and be prepared for anything unusual. But Marcus knew that no amount of preparation could shield him from an enemy who was already inside his inner circle. What if someone close to him, someone he trusted, was involved in this plot? The thought was chilling. It was then that he remembered something. A conversation he had overheard months ago at one of his many charity galas. It had been a casual discussion between two prominent figures in the business world, two individuals who, on the surface, were close allies. They had been speaking in hushed tones, their words barely audible above the murmur of other guests. But Marcus had always been attuned to the subtleties of conversation, and something in the tone of their voices had caught his attention. It was as though they were discussing something far more than just the usual business affairs. He couldn't remember the exact words, but the feeling had lingered with him ever since. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something brewing under the surface. Something more dangerous than he had realized. No, Marcus thought, shaking his head. This can't be related. It's just paranoia. But the thought wouldn't leave him. His mind kept circling back to it, feeding into his growing sense of vulnerability. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, as though the answer might appear there, written in the lines of the plaster above him. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it, recognizing the number immediately. It was his chief of security, Elias. His voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and precise. "Mr. Aldridge, we've completed a thorough sweep of the diner. We've also reviewed all the surveillance footage from the area. There's no sign of anything out of the ordinary." Elias paused for a moment, as if gathering his words. "But, we did find something odd. One of the servers there has been working on and off for a few months, and we've confirmed that he's been connected to a few people with a criminal background. No direct links to any of your enemies, but..." Marcus's pulse quickened. The words criminal background echoed in his mind. He sat up straighter in his chair, his mind immediately racing. This was new information, important information. Elias continued, "We've also been able to confirm that some of the people who frequented the diner around the same time Ryan was working there have been linked to several underground groups. No connections to anything major, but some of the individuals have been known to work in extortion. It could be a coincidence, but we're not ruling anything out." Marcus's heart beat faster. The mention of Ryan's name sent a shiver down his spine. Could the boy have been involved in something more than just warning him? Could he have somehow gotten caught up in a dangerous world that Marcus knew nothing about? It felt surreal. Ryan, the innocent boy who had polished shoes for a living, caught in the web of something sinister. "Keep digging," Marcus said, his voice tight with intensity. "Find out who's behind this. I want to know everything, Elias. If there's even a chance that someone is planning something against me, I need to know who they are and why they're doing it." "I'll get to work immediately," Elias replied, and the line went dead. Marcus hung up the phone, staring at it for a moment as he processed the new information. He had lived in a world where enemies were often hidden in plain sight, masked by the guise of alliances and business deals. But this felt different. There was no subtlety here. Someone was planning something overt, something meant to tear him down. But who, and why? What could he have possibly done to deserve this kind of targeted attack? He glanced at his watch, nearly 3 o'clock. The hours felt like they were dragging on, each minute heavier than the last. There was no time to waste. Marcus needed answers, and he needed them fast. He had to act before it was too late. In the midst of all this chaos, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Raymond, his ever-watchful bodyguard. "Sir, I've been reviewing the footage we have of the diner. I noticed something unusual. It's not about the food or anything specific with the men who might have been talking about poisoning you. But we've caught a few strange interactions on tape. The people who've been coming into the diner recently are, well, there's something off about them." Raymond's voice was calm, but Marcus could hear the undercurrent of unease. "There's one person in particular. A man in his late 40s, wearing a dark coat. He came in every morning around the same time, and he sat by the window, always in the corner. He spoke to the waitress, Carol, on several occasions, but it was more than casual conversation. I don't know what to make of it yet, but I don't like the way he looks at her. Almost as if he's trying to figure something out. We've already run a background check on him. He has no criminal record, but he's been linked to several business ventures that were not exactly on the up and up." The mention of Carol's name sent another chill down Marcus's spine. The waitress, who had always seemed like a sweet, motherly figure, was she somehow involved in this? He quickly dismissed the thought. Carol was just a waitress, someone who had been serving him for years. She was a part of the diner's family. But Raymond's observations made him wonder if things were not as simple as they appeared. "Get me all the information you have on that man, Raymond. I want to know everything, Marcus said, his voice cold with determination. And I want to be prepared. I don't care how much I have to spend, but I'm not going down without a fight. Raymond's tone shifted slightly, the professionalism still evident but tinged with something more. Understood, sir. We'll keep you updated. Just stay alert. The call ended, and Marcus sat back in his chair, his hands tightly gripping the armrests. A sense of clarity washed over him. This wasn't just a random attack, a fluke. No, there was a deeper plot at play, something more dangerous than he had first realized. And in that moment, Marcus knew one thing for certain: it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking control. He was no longer just a victim in this story. He would find the people responsible, uncover the truth, and take the fight to them, before they had the chance to strike first. The web unravels. The weight of the day bore down on Marcus as he sat alone in his office, the city's distant hum echoing in his ears. The steady click of his watch's second hand was the only sound that accompanied his thoughts, and it was a rhythmic reminder of how little time he had to act. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear the confusion clouding his mind. He had always believed that wealth could buy security, that his influence could protect him from the world's harshest elements. But today, that belief felt like a fragile illusion. Someone, had broken through, and Marcus was left scrambling to understand how and why it had happened. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, each fragment leading to more questions, more uncertainty. Raymond had been busy gathering intel on the mysterious man in the diner, the one who seemed to have been watching Carol with more than casual interest. After hours of sifting through data, they discovered that the man, named Arthur Kane, was a mid-level associate of a shadowy group that had been operating in the city for years. On paper, his connections appeared innocuous: business dealings, investments, and philanthropic efforts. But beneath the surface, there was a much darker story. Kane's name had come up in a few high-profile scandals, most of them swept under the rug, forgotten by the public eye. His history was littered with allegations of extortion, blackmail, and shady financial dealings, but no one had ever been able to pin anything solid on him. His wealth, though substantial, was far less public than Marcus's, but it was clear that Kane had cultivated an empire of his own, one built on manipulation, secrecy, and quiet threats. Marcus's fingers drummed on the edge of his desk as he pondered this new information. Arthur Kane had not just been a passive observer at the diner, he had been an active participant in something far more dangerous. And now, he was tangled up in this plot, this conspiracy, to harm him. But why? What had Marcus done to make him a target? The more Marcus thought about it, the more frustrated he became. He had spent years carving out his success, keeping his business dealings clean, his personal life hidden, and his enemies at arm's length. And yet, here he was, on the brink of being poisoned, targeted by someone he had never even met. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts, and Raymond stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway. His face was stoic, but there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of urgency. "Sir," Raymond began, his voice low, "we've got more information on Kane. I think you should hear it." Marcus waved him in, his body tensing. "Go on." Raymond approached the desk, pulling a thick file from under his arm. He laid it in front of Marcus, who opened it without hesitation. The documents inside were filled with records of Kane's past business transactions, photos of meetings with questionable figures, and excerpts from intercepted communications. But what caught Marcus's attention was a single sheet of paper, an email chain that had been flagged by their team. The subject line read, "Marcus Aldridge, target. Are you telling me Kane has been targeting me all along?" Marcus's voice was sharp, edged with disbelief. "How could I have missed this?" Raymond nodded, his expression serious. "It seems like he has, sir. We've traced these emails back to several of Kane's contacts. It's clear now, he's been plotting something against you for months. We can't yet confirm the details of his involvement with the poisoning, but we're sure he's part of it." Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. His thoughts raced, tumbling over each other as he absorbed the gravity of Raymond's words. He had never expected this, never imagined that someone like Cain, a man who had operated in the shadows for so long, would come for him so directly. Marcus had always kept his enemies close, sure, but he had never seen this coming. The idea that someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike, planning every move with precision, left him with a sinking feeling in his stomach. "How do we stop him?" Marcus's voice was quiet, but the steel in his tone was unmistakable. Raymond paused for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "We need to get ahead of him, sir. We need to expose him before he can execute whatever plan he has. We'll need to use everything we've got, resources, connections, intelligence. But first, we need to figure out exactly what he's planning and how far this conspiracy reaches. If Cain's been orchestrating this from the start, there's no telling who else might be involved." Marcus nodded grimly, a sense of clarity settling over him. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his legacy, his empire, and everything he had worked for. If Cain thought he could take it all away with a well-timed poison or a carefully crafted plot, he had another thing coming. "Make sure we have eyes on Cain," Marcus ordered, his voice now firm with purpose. "No one gets close to him without us knowing. We're going to track his every move, follow him, learn everything about his next steps. And make sure Ryan is kept safe. I don't trust that this is over just because we found out about Cain's involvement." Raymond's expression shifted slightly, there was a hint of concern in his eyes, but it was quickly masked. "Understood, sir. We'll tighten the net." Marcus stood up from his desk, his movements deliberate. The world had just become a much more dangerous place, but Marcus wasn't about to let anyone take what he had built. He would not be a victim in this story. No, he would be the one pulling the strings now, taking control of the narrative before it spiraled beyond his reach. As Raymond left to carry out the orders, Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The skyline was a familiar sight, one he had gazed upon countless times over the years. But now, it felt different. It felt like a battleground, like every building, every street, every corner could hold a threat waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. It was everything. And he would fight, no matter what it took, to protect it. Later that day, Marcus found himself back at the diner, though this time, it wasn't for the comfort he had once found in its familiar surroundings. This time, it was a strategic move, a way to observe the situation firsthand. The staff had already been alerted, though none knew the full extent of what was happening. They had been told to be cautious, to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Marcus's eyes scanned the room as he sat in his usual booth, watching the door, the people coming and going, and waiting for something, anything, that might reveal the next move in this dangerous game. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Could Cain be watching him even now, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed a familiar face, a man who had been sitting near the counter for the past hour. He was older than the others, his face weathered with years of hard living. His clothes were nondescript, just another man blending into the background. But there was something about him, something that made Marcus's instincts flare. The man glanced at Marcus for a moment, his eyes lingering a second too long, before turning his attention back to his coffee. Marcus's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the break. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the man as he made his way toward the door. Raymond was waiting outside, ready to move. He had already seen the man, and as they both stepped into the car, Marcus's thoughts were already racing ahead. They had just uncovered a piece of the puzzle, but the game had only just begun. The reckoning. The drive back to the city was quiet, save for the sound of the car's engine humming steadily through the streets. Raymond sat beside Marcus, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, ever vigilant. The tension between them was palpable, but Marcus couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his chest. He had seen the man, the one who had been watching him in the diner. And now, more than ever, Marcus knew that the time for careful investigation and subtle maneuvering was over. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. The piece of the puzzle was in place now. The man who had been sitting at the counter, staring at Marcus for just a moment too long, was no random bystander. Marcus's gut had been right. That look, the fleeting yet knowing glance, wasn't an accident. He was being watched, observed. Kane's people were closing in, and they weren't going to let up. The question now was whether Marcus could stay one step ahead of them. As they drove toward his penthouse, Marcus thought about everything he had learned over the past few days. Kane's connection to a network of shady operatives, his long history of manipulation, and now his undeniable involvement in this plot, it was all starting to make sense. And yet, in his mind, a gnawing doubt still lingered. What if it was too late? What if Kane had already anticipated his every move, prepared for this very response? No, Marcus couldn't afford to think like that. He was Marcus Aldridge, he had built an empire from the ground up, and he would not let it crumble now. He had fought too long and too hard to let some shadowy figure like Kane take everything from him. Raymond, Marcus finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice was low but filled with the quiet intensity of a man on the brink of something significant. I need you to get in touch with all of our allies, everyone we've ever worked with. We need eyes everywhere. I don't care if they're in the business world, the government, or beyond. If Kane is involved, we have to know who else is working with him. We need to put pressure on his network. Raymond nodded silently, his expression hardening. Understood, sir. I'll make the calls. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes locked on the cityscape as it passed by. The skyline glittered under the setting sun, a reminder of how far he had come. But tonight, it wasn't the view that mattered. It was the battle that lay ahead. A battle he was determined to win. The car arrived at Marcus's penthouse, and as he stepped out onto the rooftop, he felt a strange sense of finality. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The penthouse was a reflection of everything he had achieved, sleek, polished, and immaculate. But for the first time in a long while, it felt cold to him. It wasn't a home anymore, it was just a cage. Set up a meeting with the board tomorrow, Marcus ordered as he walked toward the elevator. I want them to know what's going on. If Kane's going after me, he's going after everything. They need to be prepared for the fallout. Raymond, who had followed him inside, gave a sharp nod. I'll get it arranged. I'll also set up security around your apartment for the time being, just to be safe. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, and Marcus was alone with his thoughts again. The idea of a conspiracy against him had shaken him to his core, but it also had an unexpected effect, it had reignited something in him. A fire he hadn't realized was still burning. For so long, he had been in control, navigating the high-stakes world of business with calm and precision. But now, the game had changed. And he wasn't going to sit idly by while someone tried to take his empire away. His penthouse had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the chaos of the world. But now, the world had come crashing in, and he knew that there was no escaping it. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for everything he had built, the reputation, the wealth, the power. And he wasn't going to let anyone tear it down. As the evening wore on, Marcus sat at his desk, poring over the latest intel Raymond had gathered. There was a list of names, a list of individuals who were linked to Kane, each one more dangerous than the last. Some were known criminals, others were business moguls with ties to questionable sources. But one name stood out to Marcus: Sofia Delgado. Sofia was a name he had heard before, but not in the way he expected. She was a rising star in the business world, a savvy investor known for her ruthless tactics and ability to sniff out weakness in her competitors. Marcus had heard whispers about her before, how she operated in the shadows, pulling the strings behind some of the biggest financial moves in the city. But what Marcus hadn't known was that she had close ties to Kane's network. She was the one who had helped him set up the operation that targeted Marcus. If he was going to get to Kane, he needed to go through Sofia first. She was the key to unraveling everything, the link that tied all the pieces together. And Marcus wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. The next day, Marcus made arrangements to meet with Sofia. He knew that face-to-face meetings were the best way to establish control, to read someone's intentions directly. The location he chose was a high-end restaurant known for its privacy, a place where deals were made in secret and where nothing was as it seemed. As he arrived at the restaurant, he saw Sofia standing by the window, her back to him, as if waiting for the inevitable confrontation. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that screamed power, power that Marcus knew all too well. Sofia was not someone who was easily intimidated. She was calculated, methodical, and ruthless in her pursuit of success. But Marcus had something she didn't: he had the upper hand, and he intended to keep it. "Miss Delgado," Marcus said, his voice smooth as he approached her. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Sofia turned, her eyes cold, but with a flicker of recognition. She knew who Marcus was, of course, everyone did. The world of business was small, and everyone had a role to play. But this was different. This was personal. "Mr. Aldridge," she replied, her voice measured and calm, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I assume this isn't a social visit." "No," Marcus replied, his smile tight. "I've heard a great deal about you, Miss Delgado. And I have to say, I'm impressed. Your work with Kane, it's been quite effective." Sofia's eyes flickered with something, maybe surprise, maybe caution. But she quickly masked it with a smooth smile. "I'm sure you've heard all sorts of things. The world is full of rumors." "Not rumors," Marcus said, leaning in slightly. "Facts. And one fact that I'm particularly interested in is your role in the plot against me. The one that Kane orchestrated." Sofia's eyes narrowed. She didn't flinch, but Marcus could see the way her posture stiffened ever so slightly. She wasn't used to being caught off guard, and she didn't like it. "What makes you think I'm involved?" she asked, her voice icy. "I know you are," Marcus replied, his tone unyielding. "And I know that if you want to protect yourself, you'll help me put an end to it." For a long moment, Sofia said nothing. The tension between them crackled, electric and thick. But finally, she spoke, her voice low and calculating. "I don't think you understand, Marcus," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You're just a piece in a much bigger game. If you think you can take down Kane and everything he's built, you're mistaken. He's not someone you can simply walk away from. And neither am I." Marcus smiled, his confidence unwavering. "Then let's see who's playing the game better."